Hi, everyone. So Nick already gave me a little introduction. My name is Laura Gaetano. I'm a writer, an artist, a web developer, and as he said before, I'm currently working at Travis Foundation as the managing director. Travis Foundation is a nonprofit initiative started by Travis CI, which some of you may know. I've co-organized the editions of ReasonConf, a Ruby open source software conference to specifically focus on contributing to open source software during the conference. And I also run Rails Girls Summer of Code, which is a 3-month program to get women and non-binary people involved in open source. If you're on Twitter, my handle is Alice Tragedy. I have a little story to tell. So my love story with the web started when I was 11. As part of a school project, I spent a week at a telecommunications company where my father worked to get an idea of what a real work environment would be like. And after doing busy work and photocopies for 4 days, on the last day, my father's colleague sat me down in front of a computer and showed me how HTML worked. So he made me build my very first tiny web page. I think I still have it on a floppy disk somewhere. And after that, I just got hooked. I found sites that helped you write HTML, and as perhaps some of you, as soon as I would see a really great looking website, I would right-click and go to view source, copy HTML snippets. And later on, I got into design and started putting together layouts for mini sites. I dug through my awesome archive a couple of weeks ago and found this beauty. This was a website or a layout that I designed for my personal website at the time in the early 2000s. But basically, I loved building things. As a teenager, it gave me the possibility to express myself in ways I didn't think were possible before the web. And what I also found at the time was an amazing community of people. The best part about these people was that they were like me. In the early 2000s, there were a ton of women all around the world building things, sharing tips, and learning from each other with no gatekeepers. We've talked a little bit about community today already. And if you fast forward 2 years later, I'm a part of several communities, one of them being the Rails Girls community, where I coach at workshops around Europe, the Vienna programming community, where I organized workshops for underrepresented groups, and ran the Ruby and the PyLadies meetups for a few years. And a few months ago, I moved to Berlin, and I'm now part of the programming community there too. And for each community I become a part of, I look for that very same feeling that I felt when I started building things for the web. I look for empathy. I look for a supportive environment. And I look for a community where I can feel safe to ask questions and have meaningful discussions. This is a screenshot of my first pull request on GitHub in October 2013. And to me, it didn't feel like a really big deal. It was just a contribution to a friend's repo where he was collecting little Hello World programs in different languages. But for me, it unlocked another world, the world of open source. I realized how many projects there are out there and the fact that I could potentially contribute to any of them, potentially. What interested me in open source was the social justice and the educational aspect, the possibility to make a difference. But also the fact that I could contribute to existing projects, without starting something from scratch and reinventing the wheel, which, as some of you may know, as programmers, you're always told, don't reinvent the wheel, use what's there. Open source gives you that possibility. As an open source contributor, you can also work on software you use regularly, which seems unthinkable and amazing. And at the end of the day, all of this open source stuff, for me, was again about community and finding like-minded people and a safe space to work in and express myself. I think that all of you here today might feel the same about the web and about open source, and particularly about Reason, too. And yet, for a long time, I only contributed within a small space, my own communities, such as the Rails Girls community. I didn't realize it at the time, but it mostly felt like a comfort zone I didn't really want to get out of. In our industry, we're still struggling with the diversity problem. Open source is really not any different. It's perhaps even worse. All surveys that have been conducted in the space of open source, such as the FOSS survey or the more recent open source survey by GitHub, come to the same conclusion, which is that open source is not diverse. And I'd like to go a little bit into what this means. Open source is white, male, and cisgendered. From the GitHub open source survey, they found out that the gender imbalance in open source remains profound. 95% of respondents of the survey are men. Just 3% are women, and 1% are non-binary. 1% of respondents identify as transgender, and 7% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, or another minority sexual orientation. 26% are immigrants, and 16% are members of ethnic or national minorities in the country where they currently live. Even though the trend is changing, which is great, many open source contributors still don't get paid for their open source work. They still work on projects after the office or on weekends. And what this means is that only people with a certain lifestyle or people who can afford it financially end up contributing mostly. So open source, like much of tech, is biased. It relies on input from a non-diverse, privileged community, which means that the output is going to have blind spots. Privilege, it's a word that many of us throw around, many of us talk about. And I have a great analogy for this. So John Scalzi said in an article, in the role-playing game known as the real world, straight white male is the lowest difficulty setting there is. This is, for me, one of the best ways to understand and explain privilege. Playing on the low difficulty setting doesn't mean you aren't good at the game. And it also doesn't mean that your successes aren't your own and that you didn't get there partly by yourself. But what it means is that a lot of people have arbitrarily been assigned a much higher difficulty setting in that game. And there's not much we can do about it. So what we have to focus on then is understanding what our privilege gives us and how we can use it for the benefit of those less privileged than us. In the late 80s, American feminist Peggy McIntosh wrote an article titled White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, where she described personal examples of unearned advantage, such as this one. I can turn on the television and open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. In this article, she goes on and lists many other things that she's found out through her research or through just observing the things that she has access to that other people don't. And over the last few years, I have personally come a long way in understanding privilege, and even though I am a woman in tech, so for a lot of people, a minority, I'm also white, I'm able-bodied, I'm relatively wealthy, I'm cisgender, and I am straight. All of these factors play into how I am perceived, how people relate to me, and help me get to levels that aren't accessible to other people. And when I read Peggy McIntosh's list of examples of white privilege, I realized how much I take for granted. Safety, representation in the media, and the possibility to rent a house in a nice neighborhood. I'm just going to get it out of the way. All of us are biased. We can't do that much about it, but we can try and understand how bias works. We base our future decisions on our own experience of the world, but also what we've learned through our education, culture, or environment. Being aware of our biases is the first step for inclusion. And I hope you're seeing where I'm getting to. Because of how bias and prejudice influence our decisions, it's not a very good idea to have a homogeneous group of people create products that will be used by many different kinds of people. When that happens, we find ourselves with somewhat unintended and unexpected consequences. Some of you may have heard about this. In 2015, the photo sharing platform Flickr introduced the auto-tagging feature. And when you uploaded a photo, it would automatically create some tags to categorize the photo based on an algorithm. This photo of a black man named William by a photographer named Corey was auto-tagged by the system with the word ape. That same year, Google Photos had a similar mishap with photos of two black friends being tagged as gorillas. In 2017, a man in Nigeria posted a video that made the rounds on Twitter, so some of you may have seen it. I didn't put it in my slides because I don't know how making video work in slides works and the unintended consequences that it will have. But I can share it later on Twitter. Basically, the sensor in a bathroom soap dispenser worked for every single white person who used it, but not for him, because his skin was too dark. A few years ago, a new social network called Vero popped up. Their manifesto included the following statements. Users who have your phone number in their address book get an alert that you've joined Vero. Users who have your number can send you a connect request, even if you have turned connect requests off. We encourage people to present themselves as they do in real life. This makes it easier for people to find you. This is just a screenshot of the manifesto. I most definitely see where these great ideas come from. So the idea behind this social network is to have your friends find you easily. But as a person who's been the target of harassment, this actually horrifies me. It horrifies me because it ignores the need for privacy. It overrides a user's preferences without giving them a choice. And it doesn't take into account that some people just don't want to be found easily. Some of the people who, as a person who is a target of harassment, might have your number are your stalkers. You don't really want them to know that you've joined a new social network, and you certainly don't want them to connect with you on that social network. And it's not just software. A few years ago, sociologist Zeynep Tufekci wrote an article about her attempt to document protests in Istanbul, only to be hindered by the size of her phone. It's not really a secret that the average male hand is bigger than the average woman's hand. And clearly her phone was not designed to be held and used one-handed by hands bigger than hers. So what she ended up with was being unable to cover her mouth to avoid tear gas as she was trying to document the protest. What all of these examples tell me is that these products were designed without taking into account a really large portion of the population. This is another thing that was found out through the GitHub open source survey. After the survey results were analyzed, women are more likely than men to encounter language or content that makes them feel unwelcome, as well as stereotyping and unsolicited sexual advances. So where does this leave us? Are we too full of privilege, too prejudiced, too biased to write software, to work on hardware? As I said before, I think it's important for us to look at our privilege, to examine our conscious and unconscious biases, and be aware of how they impact the decisions that we make. Good news, there's ways in which you can actually make your project and your communities more inclusive. If you're part of a project, there are ways in which you can make that place better for everyone. Making your project accessible is hard. As a project maintainer, it's often really hard to realize how much knowledge about the project is in your head and undocumented anywhere. So my advice to all of you, if you haven't done so yet, is to create a README, add a license, create documentation, update the documentation, and if needed, ask people who've never used your project to read through the README. Is the project scope understandable? Are the setup and usage instructions clear? This is going to help you fill in the gaps in your documentation and make your project more accessible. One of the projects that I work on, as I said before, is Rails Girls Summer of Code, and we do have some open source repos on GitHub. This is a screenshot of our README, and you might not be able to read all of it in the back, but the basic idea of our README is that it's clear without being too verbose, and it gives you an idea of what the project is about. And finally, we've tried to make the language friendly and inviting. Fun fact, emojis are great tools for that. What we also have is a troubleshooting guide with possible scenarios of things going wrong during setup and how to fix them. A lot of new contributors usually come across these issues where they're setting up the project for the first time. You, as a more seasoned contributor, have set up the project perhaps 3 years ago. Things have changed, and there's no keeping track of what things might be wrong for newcomers. If you want to have contributors on board, create a contributing guide and add clear guidelines for doing things like reporting a bug, requesting a feature, or picking up an issue to work on. Mark the easier newcomer-friendly issues as such with a note or a label. It's going to help you keep the project organized, and it's going to give contributors a possibility to pick tickets to work on. For those of you that use GitHub, and I know that Reason is hosted on GitHub, you have that really easy. GitHub has been giving guidelines and tools on creating a contributing guide and on specifically telling newcomers, hey, this is your first issue or this is your first pull request, take a look at the contribution.md. So it makes it really easy for you to kind of get started and improve your documentation that way. Again, an example from our Rails Go Summer of Code repos, all of them. In the contribution guide, we have an overview of all the labels that we use. And so it gives all contributors an idea of whether an issue could be a good fit for them. And because we had a lot of people completely new to open source and GitHub contributions, we specifically added instructions and help on creating a pull request with links to the GitHub documentation. It may seem like 101 level for you, but this might actually make the change between a new contributor and only non-new contributors. Last but not least, add and enforce a code of conduct. There's been a lot of discussion about code of conducts in the tech industry, in the open source communities. A lot of people are against them, or a lot of people advocate for them. You should choose a code of conduct that works for you and for your community. If necessary, take one and change it to suit your needs. What's important is that you don't just kind of copy-paste it without thinking of the consequences of having that code of conduct on there. You should explicitly state the kind of behavior that isn't acceptable. You should give examples. You should state what the consequences will be for anyone that doesn't abide by the code of conduct, and understand what ultimately the code of conduct is there for. If something happens, enforce it. Stand your ground and don't make compromises. This is important, and it's going to have an impact on your community in the long run. Later, I'll also be sharing a really, really great resource that basically gives you the 101 on how code of conducts work and some resources to get started if you're looking for templates or ideas or just more context to what a code of conduct is there for. So this isn't just about projects, right? Again, there's the word community. We want to make our community more inclusive. And all of you in this room have the possibility to make choices that will impact in which direction the Reason community grows. Leverage your privilege. You can amplify the voices of marginalized people who are less privileged than you. Sometimes it's as simple as sharing a tweet from someone who does really important work but doesn't have the same authority or visibility as you. Beware of ableist language and linguistic microaggressions. Language is really tricky, and we learn so much from each other that it's important to stop and think if the words that we use are really what we mean to use. Additionally to that, in programming communities, many of us are speaking in a language that isn't our native language, which means that we don't always understand what the implications or what the double meanings of some words are. Generally, I'd advise you to avoid using ableist language. These are words that devalue people who have mental or physical disabilities, slurs, or words which may make people feel unwelcome. These are words such as crazy, insane, dumb, lame, and the good old guys when you're speaking to an audience of not just men. Don't use the word normal when what you mean is like me. You can try and find replacements for ableist words. Try and get a sense of what you mean to say and come up with different words. I used to use the word crazy a lot and lame, and I started replacing them with unbelievable or ridiculous. It actually works quite well. And all of you, most of you here are programmers. Use technology to your advantage. There's a possibility to actually automate a lot in that context. And something that we've done in one of our Slack organizations, which I can't even take the credit for because Slack basically, or Slackbot did all the work, was to basically just customize Slackbot. Every time that someone would type in the word guys, Slackbot would reply, I think you mean pals, or I think you mean team. And so this is actually really good for your brain's muscle memory, because after a while, you don't want Slackbot to constantly just kind of jump at you and say like, hey, I think you mean pals. So you just stop using the word guys, and then you move that out of your Slack organization into the real world. It does work pretty much with every word, even though it might depend a little bit on context. So I just suggest to try it out and maybe see if you can find other uses for automation. I said before that as a white woman, I'm still fairly privileged. Diversity isn't just white women. There's so much more to diversity than people like me. And I've been guilty of that as a conference and as an event organizer, to think that as soon as I had a couple of white women on my lineup, I was good to go. But we have to do better. And what this means is expanding our network to people who aren't like us. You're going to make mistakes. I said, I've made those mistakes. I know better now, and I'm trying to tell people how to not make them or how to learn from them. No matter how much you try or how careful you are, you're going to encounter situations where you're just going to mess up. If you get called out, these are some of the things that you can do to handle the situation. Apologize. And when I say apologize, I mean a real apology. Say, I'm sorry for what I've done. Do not indirectly put the blame on the person who called you out, saying, I'm sorry that you feel offended by what I've said. All this does is signify that you don't think their feelings are valid. And this isn't about you right now, but it's about that person who called you out. Don't justify yourself. Don't talk about how you really didn't mean it. You'll usually just kind of end up digging a deeper hole for yourself. And when you're the observer seeing that happen, it's really, really painful. Just don't justify yourself. Also, don't make it about you because it isn't. Learn from that mistake. Take it as an opportunity to learn something. If you're not quite sure what you've done wrong, you can also ask politely or try and look it up. There's a ton of resources about intersectionality, about privilege, about bias that you can look up, and I'll also be sharing some more resources on a slide later. Also, move on. I have another little story. Once in a conversation, I misgendered someone who had recently come out as non-binary. And I was so used to using their old pronouns that I completely misgendered them while they were in front of me. I felt so bad. I felt terrible. I quickly corrected my mistake and just sort of used their new pronoun instead and continued the conversation. There was nothing I could do about it. The mistake had been made. But it was time for me to move on. And I tried to just not say, I'm sorry, I realize what I've done. I've just misgendered you. Oh, it's so terrible. No, just move on. At the beginning of this talk, I shared with you the importance of a community. And if it wasn't for those women in the early 2000s building things together in different parts of the world, I probably wouldn't be here today. It took me a lot of very weird jobs, working in the music industry, and a failed art degree to end up here, right where I had actually started as an 11-year-old passionate about the magic of the web. And this is what I learned over the last years. Open source is ultimately about people. It's about code, it's about software, it's about other things, but it's particularly about people. And so I would like for us to start moving towards a more compassionate web. I want us to realize that the things we do or say have real consequences in the real world. I talked about privilege and bias, and I would like for us to use these things in our favor. Ultimately, I'd like to think that most of us are good people and that when we mess up, we're able to learn from our mistakes and do better. Thank you.